Hello, my name is Mark Noyce, and it still feels kind of weird to say my last name without having to spell it. Anyway, I'm a self-published author, and I am here to share my books with you with a reading. That's right, I'm going to do some readings. You might remember the one I did last week of my story Tulips. I also have some short stories, and I'm going to read the first chapter of each of them. If you like what you hear and you want to read the rest, then follow the link in the description to pick up the entire thing for a little over 99 cents. 99 cents is the price without VAT. I am one for technicalities. You see, I don't like saying that they only cost 99 cents when they cost just a little bit more. I'm also working on the plausibility of full-length audiobooks, so maybe you can look forward to that. I don't know. I'm researching it. It's a lot harder than it looks. Anyway, that's enough boring things. Here's the story I call Not Another Camping Story. It's about a group of boys who go camping and things just don't go quite to plan. Because they never really do in camping stories, do they? No. This one deviated from where I originally wanted to go with it, but I still like how it finished up. I did plan for it to go a little differently than most camping stories. Ah well. So, without further ado, Not Another Camping Story. I apologise in advance for my voice. I've got a bit of a cold, but this is the best time to record. I was informed last time that in the last video there was some things that shouldn't have been there. And so hopefully there won't be any kind of, interference, I should say, this time around. So yes, camping's Not Another Camping Story. Let's read. On a dark night, just like this one, in a wood, just like this one, James began his horror story with all the cliches. His fellow camper, Mickey, was having none of it. You know how many scary stories start like that? He asked, making sarcastic air quotes to show how little he was scared. He folded his arms and leaned back just a little. He didn't want to lean too far and end up falling backwards off the log he was sat on. He, James, and two other boys were camping in the woods as a scout troop. Mickey was sat next to his dad, the scout leader, and James was sat on his own as the designated storyteller. And the other two boys were sat on a log of their own together. Mickey's dad, Peter, had to put his hand over his mouth to hide his amusement at his son's sarcastic comment. Hey, do you know how many woods are just like this one? And how many people take camping trips just like this one? James countered. Mickey rolled his eyes. Well, he's got you there, son, Peter said, patting his son on the back. He nodded towards James. Well, go on and finish your story then, he instructed. Mickey muttered something about James only just starting the story under his breath. As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, James began, casting a glance at Mickey and putting his flashlight back under his face to look as scary as possible. There were a group of boys who were camping together. They thought they were safe. Well, they thought wrong, James said. He snapped the last word out to try and frighten everyone. I didn't. Oh well. David and Andy, the other two boys, flinched. Mickey and Peter did not. What happened? David asked timidly. James smirked maniacally and continued his story. Oh, they had fun. They had s'mores. They told camptime stories. Things were going well for them. They said their goodnights. They went to bed. And that's when things started going wrong for them. One of the campers heard a rustling near his tent. There was a growl too. He was scared, but he had to know what was out there. He could only see a shadow through his tent. He opened the tent up and stepped outside. Whatever attacked him was so quiet that no one heard when he was attacked. That's why none of them helped him. But what attacked him? Andy asked. Both he and David were shaking a little out of fear. Mickey and Peter were still pretty unperturbed. James gnashed his teeth together, baring his teeth like they were fangs. Andy and David jumped again, and James laughed at their expense before continuing. Not long after the attack, one of the other boys had to pee and headed out of his tent too. He saw that there was a lamp lit in the other boy's tent. They had been told to only light the lamp in the tent in an emergency. If they wanted to find their way back, then they had to put the lamp outside. He went to the tent to see what the problem was and tell the other guy off for breaking the rules. He saw that there wasn't a shadow first. That's when he got a little worried. He went to unzip the tent only to find it was already open. He peeked inside and saw nothing. He took the lamp out so nothing would catch on fire, and that's when he heard it. A terrible, terrible howling. His head snapped up where the howl had come from, but he couldn't see anything. It was too dark. He could still hear though. He heard something approaching him. It sounded like footsteps. Something was moving towards him, and quickly. He grabbed the lamp, ready to fend off any wild animals. Then, BAM! James exclaimed, clapping his hands together for emphasis. Mickey cursed himself for jumping in surprise. He was getting into the story too. Just another thing to curse himself for. His friend, covered in cuts and blood, jumped into the clearing where they'd made camp. Both boys screamed at each other in surprise, and that's when the second one saw it. The creature that had attacked his friend. It was like a panther or something, only it was much bigger. Its teeth were much bigger too. The boys screamed again and made a run for it. The boys screamed again and they made a run for it, but there was no way they could outrun it. Everyone else in the camp had woken up by now. They saw the creature and panicked too. One of them had a baby, and he ran like the wind out of there, leaving the young lads to their fate. He made it, but no one else did. The forest rangers scoped out the camp the next day and found all the bodies. Only the man and the baby got out alive. James finished his story. He was a master storyteller. He was quiet when he needed to be and loud when he had to be. He knew just how to say things to really draw people in. There was just one problem with his story. It was the same problem with almost all stories like it. So, how do you know this happened? Mickey sarcastically asked. He'd enjoyed the story, which was why he was being extra bitter about it. David and Andy were looking particularly scared too, and he wanted to reassure them it was all false. James was ready for him, and that question. Oh, that's easy, Mick, James replied casually. I know because I was that baby, James declared, turning up the intensity. Mickey felt his skin crawl. David and Andy weren't reassured in the least. If anything, they were more frightened now than they had been before. That little plan had certainly backfired on Mickey. Sure you were, James. Sure you were. Mickey sighed, completely unconvinced. Pete clapped his hands together to get everyone's attentions. Well, that was a pretty good story, wasn't it, boys? He asked, looking around the campfire. Mickey still looked disoriented. James was smirking at the compliment, and Andy and Dave looked like they'd need therapy before they slept again. It's getting late, so I think we should get to bed already, he said. Andy and Dave weren't too happy about that. It just wasn't their night. Nevertheless, they did as they were told and got ready for bed, retreating to their tents for the night. James also got up and left, leaving father and son to take care of everything. They set about cleaning up the campsite a little, putting away any trash they could find and putting things back in bags. Mickey took care of the campfire and said goodnight to his dad before heading off for his home tent. He really needed a good night's sleep after the day they'd had. It was the first day at the camp, so they'd woken up earlier than usual and spent what felt like forever on the minibus on the way to the camp. They had to set everything up after that, which also seemed to take way too long. They were all very efficient campers and didn't take too long. It just felt like it did because there was always more to do. Mickey entered his tent and laid down in his sleeping bag. He gave one last stretching yawn and closed his eyes, falling asleep. It didn't take too long thanks to all the work that he'd done. Mickey was woken up a few hours later by a familiar feeling in what he imagined was his bladder. He grumbled as he slowly woke up and tried to gather his senses. He worked his arms out of his sleeping bag and checked the watch on his wrist to see the time. It was 2:30 in the morning. Mickey groaned and fought his way out of his sleeping bag. He could fight a lot of things, but he couldn't fight nature for any longer than he had to. He clambered up to his knees and crawled out of his tent. He looked around after he got out of the tent. Everything seemed to be where it was left. The campsite had been left alone by any local fauna, and all his fellow campers seemed to be sleeping as soundly as he was just a few minutes ago. All the tents were zipped up, and there were no lights coming from any of them. They were arranged in a small little row, with James's tent being at the end. Mickey considered playing a prank on James as he walked past his tent, but decided against it in the end. James would never let him hear the end of it, neither would his dad. He continued walking past James's tent and into the woods to relieve himself. Mickey returned to the campsite about 5 minutes later at the most. He hadn't walked out very far. There was no real need to. It didn't take him long to see that something was different from how it had been not just 5 minutes ago. The flap on James's tent was open, and billowing around in the light wind freely. He might have heard the sound even if he hadn't seen the flaps. Mickey sighed and approached the tent. He thought that James was just trying to play a trick on him, or might have needed the bathroom himself. Mickey held the flaps of the tent open and peered inside. The small space was empty, save for James's sleeping bag and some entertainment James had brought for himself. It was mostly comic books that he would have read using the sunlight or a torch. It would have been pretty stupid to hold comics near an open fire. Mickey saw that James's gas lamp was out, which was a bad sign. It was worse too because it was on its side. It looked like there was even a small crack in the glass, suggesting it had been knocked over. Mickey took out his own flashlight and turned it on. He pointed it at the lamp and saw there was indeed a crack down the side of it. Mickey sighed and scanned around with the aid of his flashlight. Apologies. There seemed to be nothing else out of the ordinary. James's flashlight was gone too. From the looks of it, James had just been in a bit too much of a hurry to get to the bathroom in time. That theory seemed a little silly given how they were in the woods, nature's bathroom. It was just the best one Mickey had though, and would have to do. Mickey sighed and stood up, brushing off any dirt that might have made its way onto his clothes. Now that the mystery was solved, he just had to get back to bed and get a proper answer in the morning. Mickey was on his way to his own tent when he heard a twig snap behind him. He thought that James had probably made a little more noise than he intended to when coming back to his tent. Mickey turned around with a smile on his face. They had an occasional fallout, but he and James were friends at heart. "Hey James, it's cool," he began before realizing that James wasn't there. There was nothing in front of him. That suggested that perhaps what had snapped the twig might have just been some sort of animal. Peter's tent was right next to his, Mickey's, so that's where Mickey headed to first. He moved calmly and carefully so as not to spook anything that might be hiding in the darkness. If he was able to get to Peter's tent without any trouble, then he would have been able to get to his own tent too. If something happened, then he could quickly raise the alarm and his dad would know what to do. Mickey reached Peter's tent safely and let out a sigh of relief. That's when he realized that there was a small problem with what he had planned. If the noise he heard hadn't been James, then James was still somewhere out there in the woods. Mickey pulled out his flashlight and shone the beam down on the ground. If it was a wild animal, it would probably have been spooked by the light. There was also another possibility to consider. "James, come on man, that's not funny," Mickey called out. He didn't want to speak too loud and wake up the other campers. There was no reaction from either them or the darkness around the camp. Mickey carefully moved toward his own tent again. There was something in there that would be some help in his current situation. He knelt down and felt around inside the tent until he found what he was looking for. "Yes!" he exclaimed quietly when he felt the flint he'd kept in his tent. He made his way to where the campfire had been, shining his flashlight around to ward off anything that might be out there. He let out another small celebratory cry when he saw that there was enough kindling left in the campfire to light another small fire. Small enough to let him get a good view all around the campfire and while things away, while also not being so bright that it woke up everybody else. Mickey lit the fire and looked around again. He couldn't see anything that he didn't see before, but he did hear another twig snap. He snapped his head around to where the sound had come from and saw a shadowy figure running away, as well as hearing the sound of rustling leaves as it moved further away. Mickey let out a sigh of relief and headed back towards his tent. It was just a small animal that had been curious and now had been scared away. Mickey snapped up straight and his hair stood on end when he heard what sounded like the most blood-curdling roar he'd ever heard. It came from the direction that whatever critter he'd been dealing with before had run off towards. "Damn it, James!" were the first words out of Mickey's mouth when he regained his senses. He slapped his hand to his mouth once they were out. He had shouted them a little too loudly. He looked around and saw that he hadn't woken up anyone else. James's tent was still open, and there was still no one in there. James hadn't responded to his call either. There was only one conclusion to draw. James was still out there in the woods with whatever had made that terrible noise. Though, of course, there was always the possibility that James had made the sound himself. It was actually the easiest solution. It was also probably the most likely. Mickey considered waking up his dad and decided against it in the end. He didn't want to be laughed at even more if it turned out to just be a practical joke played by James. Mickey gritted his teeth as visions of his own humiliation played out in his mind. "Damn it, James! If you ain't dead, I'll kill you myself," Mickey grumbled to himself as he set out into the woods to find James. I'm afraid that's the end of the first chapter. If you liked what you heard and you want to know what happens to James and Mickey, then follow the link in the description and buy the whole story for yourself. If you liked what you heard as far as just my voice went, which would be quite good considering the condition I'm in, then I'm always interested in voice work too. You want my voice associated with something of yours? Just send me a message and we can work something out. Until then, I'll see you next time with another reading. I have 2 more to go, unless I suddenly finish another story before then. Farewell. Bye.